there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up for the first half of July of 2017. As was implied by my TBR video for Wading Moose's Canada 150 challenge, all of what I have read so far this month has been by Canadian authors. The first thing that I finished off this month was a book that I mentioned at the tail end of my last wrap-up, which is M.G. Vassanji's When She Was Queen, which is another collection of his short stories. Again, these are mostly centered around Ismaili communities, although interestingly, fewer of these stories are set in Don Mills in Toronto or in Dar es Salaam, as most of his novels and short stories have been. This actually has characters who are in India and in the United States and in Kenya. A lot of these also had less of an immediate moment to them. I think a lot of Vassanji's short stories that I've read in the past are very much about that slice in time and that moment for those characters. But this one surprised me because there was more focus on the long range and on the life of the characters across ages. There's a lot more looking forwards and looking backwards. Near the end, there is a story that is set in diary entries that a woman started writing right at the point of partition to a friend of hers who ended up in a different country, and it goes, and eventually they reunite, which is not a spoiler. It's not really a plot-driven, it's more of a mood-driven piece. It's an interesting change from what I normally expect of his writing, and I quite enjoyed most of these stories. So after that, I read Catherine Hernandez's Scarborough. I actually grew up in Scarborough, and I was mentioning this book to my mother, and she said, "Our Scarborough?" And I ended up saying, sort of, because it's not actually about Scarborough as a whole. It's very specifically about the Kingston Road corridor. It's very South Scarborough, which I feel like I have to mention now because when I talk to people from other parts of Canada, and especially when I lived out west, when you meet more people who are multi-generationally Canadian, which growing up, I genuinely knew almost no one with Canadian parents until I went to university. And I very rarely met anyone whose family had been in Canada for more than a couple of generations until I moved to Calgary when I was almost 30. And I've always presented that as, well, I'm from Scarborough and everybody's an immigrant in Scarborough. A number of the characters in this are Canadian white people with, a lengthy history in Canada. And two of the characters are Aboriginal, they're Mi'kmaq, so obviously they've been in Canada forever. And it surprised me because that isn't my image of Scarborough. So I actually went and looked at the demographics of Scarborough Rouge River, which is North Scarborough, which is where I grew up, and Scarborough Guildwood, which is south of the 401. And the demographics are actually hugely different, and I had no idea. So that area in the south is actually, has a much smaller immigrant population, and the north has a much higher one. And the individual ethnic demographics are very different. So the fact that I read this and it surprised me and that it didn't feel true to the demographics of Shepherd East Village, which they're now calling it, because this was not about that. This was not about Scarborough. This is about Kingston Road. In any case, that's not a criticism. The story is told through primarily the eyes of 3 parent-child combinations. So 6 main characters, in addition to emails between a woman who runs not an early years center, but an early literacy center, I think, and between her and her boss. So those are interspersed between the individual character chapters. And there are also a few chapters that are by sort of bystanders. I really enjoyed the contrasting chapters between the different parents and their children. One of the things that I think some of it is emphasizing is a kind of generational shift. And so I think those contrasting parent-child chapters did really well with that. And it also really made it an interesting portrayal of the way parents and children interact. And a lot of the parents here are parents who have fallen into hard times or have made poor choices in their life, or they've both fallen into hard times and made poor choices. And as a result, they're struggling, and they are not probably the parents that they would like to be. And so a lot of it is about the challenge of that. And then you also get the woman who's running the literacy center and the frustrations that she has dealing with this specific community when her boss downtown wants this to play out in a different way and it's not playing out that way. So I really enjoyed that, and I thought it did a really good job of portraying the generational split, the class issues, and that kind of political issue of being the outlying area and having to answer to people who don't understand that culture. That said, there are also some chapters in here that are by individual bystanders. So you get one chapter from their point of view. There was potential to them where you could have gotten more of the story, but I think with a lot of them, it almost felt like the author was trying to shed slightly more light on an issue, but in doing that, it kind of simplified things, which I didn't think was completely successful. But I mean, still overall, I thought this was really solid and definitely worth reading. And even though I said it's not my part of Scarborough, you still get those references of places that are close enough. Like they're going to the No Frills that's at Markham and Lawrence as opposed to the Food Basics at, Markham and Shepherd. But it's still almost the same area. They're still taking the 86 bus that goes Kingston Road to the zoo. So there was that draw to me as well. So, I mean, I enjoyed reading those references, but I also thought that the book was overall quite successful. After that, I picked up Birdie by Tracey Lindberg, which was extremely interesting. When I talked about this in the TBR video, I mentioned it in plot terms of this woman from northern Alberta, and she travels to BC. But it's more than that. And I think describing it in those plot terms hurts the book because it's not that. As I read it, I felt like it was a portrayal of a woman's mind as she was going through a breakdown because of PTSD. Now, interestingly, when I read an interview with the author suggested that we are supposed to be interpreting her experience as being an actual time travel experience in sort of a spiritual sense. But in the actual text itself, I don't think it forces you to see it one way or the other. You could read it as sort of a metaphorical portrayal of mental illness and the result of having lived through poverty and repeated sexual abuse and casual and blatant racism throughout this woman's life. Or you could read it as her having this actual spiritual or religious experience that is enabling her to become an owl and travel through time. And I know when I read reviews, some people really gave this harsh ratings because it is not a linear plot. And there is a lot that's up in the air. Until the end, there are a lot of points where you actually have no idea what specifically happened to her. Personally, I found that really interesting, and I was intrigued and wanted to find out more. But again, depending on how much you like that style of writing, this will either be a big selling feature or be something that will make you not want to read this at all. But personally, I really appreciated and was intrigued by the style. I also thought socially it was very interesting because it deals with, as I said, the issues of what happens when someone has spent their life in poverty and in that cycle of sexual abuse and parental neglect. And also it touches on things like the missing Aboriginal women and the issue of status, because this character is a Cree woman, but very few people in her extended family actually have status. So they're not entitled to housing on the reserve, so they live just outside of it. So there are a lot of interesting little historical tidbits in there. In addition to the whole she's looking for an actor from the Beachcombers, which is really hilarious if you were of a certain generation. So yeah, I thought this was spectacular, but some people are really not going to enjoy this. So after that, I picked up a piece of nonfiction, which is Montcalm and Wolfe by Roch. This is the history of the two generals from the Battle of the Plains of Abraham from 1759, which is what took Canada from having been a French colony into and made it a British colony. It has a nice introduction to both the setup of the battle, the way the battle played out, the lives of both of the generals leading up to that, what they were doing in France, in England, a little bit of the histories of their families. And as an overview, I thought this was solid. It definitely gives you a bit of the historical context. The author kind of assumes that you understand the fallout, so there isn't a huge amount of follow-up, which I think is probably true for people who went to school in Quebec and maybe not so much in the rest of Canada. It's one of those things where I feel like the further west you go, the less weight this carries, which maybe it shouldn't given the history, but I think is probably true. What bothered me about this is that there are no references. And not only is there's no bibliography in the back, there's no reference section in the back, there are no footnotes. There is no author's note where he talks about where he did his research or who he talked to or what archives he went to. So none of this is sourced. There was one point when he's talking about James Wolfe's youth, and I thought, and that was fairly early on in the book, and I thought, that sounds really interesting, I'd like to read more about that, and I flipped to the back to assuming that there would be references, and there were no references. So I really was baffled by that. I thought, who writes a history, clearly nonfiction, and doesn't include references? So that didn't impress me. So yeah, as an introduction to what happened at the Plains of Abraham and who participated, this was interesting, but yeah, if you're looking to know more, this book is not going to guide you to it, and I have no idea where any of this information came from, so I was frustrated by that. So as I usually do when I read some serious nonfiction, I followed that up by some fluff, and that is Bryan Lee O'Malley's Seconds, which is a character piece / urban fantasy about a young woman who is a chef. She'd been working for someone else. She's going to go open her own restaurant, and she's made some mistakes in her life, and her relationships are not necessarily the best. And a house spirit shows up, and she gains the ability to change mistakes that she's made inside a restaurant. And it's a fun little story. It is Bryan Lee O'Malley's classic art style. If you've read Scott Pilgrim, it is very similar to that, but this is colored. It is similarly about characters who are not super likable. The main character is selfish and does make poor decisions, largely because she is selfish, and a lot of the drama in the story comes out of that. But it's an interesting take on both this dueling house spirits, one's ability to change time, parallel worlds, and kind of that youth angst as people try to figure out their lives in their quarter-life crisis period. So I was reasonably entertained by this. The art style is not my favorite, so this is not going to be a favorite of mine, but I definitely think that for people who loved Scott Pilgrim, this is a perfectly nice follow-up with slightly more mature characters. Not a lot to say about that. I liked the balance of reality and fantasy that it took, because I've seen some reviews that described it more as magical realism, but it really felt more like urban fantasy to me. But I don't know. If you have read it, what do you think? And do you think there's really a difference? Because I'm not sure that there is. I feel like sometimes the line that gets drawn there tends to be the cover. If it's a more literary looking book cover, then we call that magical realism, and if it looks like genre fiction, then it's called urban fantasy. But I don't really know where the line is for that. And finally is a book that I'm not quite finished with, which is Our Story, Aboriginal Voices on Canada's Past, which is a series of short stories, each of which is by a different author, and it goes chronologically through history. And it's supposed to be centering Canadian history from an Aboriginal perspective. And so different writers are writing from the perspective generally of their region or of their nation. And the first story is about the Mohawk creation story. I think the final story is about Oka, the Oka crisis. I think I have 2 stories left in this right now. As with anything with multiple authors, some were more to my taste, some were not. Interestingly, not everyone who wrote for this is actually primarily an author. There are some people who are more activists. There's an actress whose story I quite enjoyed. But what made this interesting is that each story also has a contributor's note from the author, where they explain why they wrote about what they wrote about and why they chose the specific period that they chose. And I thought in a lot of cases that was more interesting than the stories themselves. And there were actually a couple of cases in here where I didn't particularly like the story, but I was fascinated by the contributors' notes. So I definitely think it was worth picking up just for that, because it says, I think, a lot about how people frame history, knowing how they were inspired to write these different bits. So that's been my July so far. It's been very Canadian so far. But yeah, I think maybe I've had enough of that, because I am in Houston and it is July and it is incredibly hot and humid outside. So maybe it's time to read something that doesn't make me wish that I was back in Canada right now. And I'm going to be traveling at the end of the month, so I don't know how much I'm going to get through at the end of the month. But in any case, I hope your July is going well. That's it for now. Ciao.